Pace, salam, mangwanani, kia ora. Welcome to today's People's Summit plenary live panel for the World Eco-Social Forum. I am Alison Phipps and I hold the UNESCO Chair in Refugee Integration through Languages and the Arts at the University of Glasgow. And I'm joined today on my panel by Dr. Hiab Johannes, Dr. Picky Diamond, and Tawana Sitole. Dr. Hiab Johannes is a researcher with a PhD in the realities of Eritrean refugees in a carceral age from the University of Glasgow, where he currently works as academic coordinator for the UK-funded Culture for Sustainable and Inclusive Peace. Dr. Picky Diamond is Māori, indigenous to Aotearoa, New Zealand, a descendant of Ngāti Tuwhatoa and Ngāpuhi tribes, with a British heritage stemming from Sussex. She's an academic developer and doctoral candidate at Auckland University of Technology, who co-designed Ako Aranui, an Indigenous alignment, and is developing a treaty-honouring curriculum. Picky has been a collaborating researcher with UNESCO RILA and also UNESCO's Art Lab on the wisdom that is prevalent in Indigenous cultures, which offer new ways of being, doing, and knowing. And finally, Tawana Sitole is poet, playwright, mbira musician, educator, and facilitator. His ancestral family name, Ganyamatope, is a reminder of his heritage, which inspires him to make connections with other people through creativity and the natural outlook to learn. As co-founder of Seeds of Thought Arts Group, Tawana's work involves supporting and facilitating access to the creative arts. This is the first partner live panel of the People's Global Summit, Co-Building an Eco-Social World, Leaving No One Behind, a global 4-day event from today until the 2nd of July. And the summit's vision is of a People's Global Summit that emerges from the COVID-19 pandemic, from the climate crisis, and which allows the need to co-build a new eco-social world based on values that shape policies and practices to ensure sustainability and good quality life cycles, not only for each human being, but for each part of our ecosystem, which we all depend on, leaving no one and nothing in nature behind. The purpose of the summit is to shape the Global Values Declaration for a new eco-social world that will be delivered to the United Nations High-Level Political Forum in July 2022 and will create a catalyst for further global action. I'd like to begin by inviting Picky from Aotearoa, New Zealand, to acknowledge our place. Picky.
Haere manga manuhiri ngā haue whaka hui hui mai nei te kaupapa. Haere mai rā. Let us take our place as people of the land to host you, to welcome you into our world with tikanga derived from te ao Māori. Let us manaki, let us mana aki, let us mana aki. Whakatau mai rā, whakatau mai rā, whakatau mai rā.
E kanuaro dini Ganyamatope Zapasi Notenda Retri Pano. We're all here, and if this be a building, very well then. Impress, let it impress. as a fingerprint of devotion. And if this be a center, very well then, gather, let it gather as an old place of healing.
Thanks to Piki and to Tawana for their acknowledgement of the lands from which we speak. Aotearoa New Zealand for Piki, and here in the Ark at the University of Glasgow, a new building sited on a place of ancient healing, an old general hospital, but also opening out with a park to the public. Whilst it is at the heart of this summit to aspire to be living on a planet where no one is left behind, each of our three panelists knows that the reality is different. Each knows acutely and has described in their keynote video ways in which they have struggled to affirm the personhood of those who are still left behind. And critically, that many of the world's cultures, the idea of personhood also extends to nature and to land and to the spirits of the ancestral realm. For Western notions of statehood and scholarship, such an animation is at best troubling and at worst often derided, as exemplified in this quotation from Amitav Ghosh. Amitav says, "The questions of who is brute and who is fully human, who makes meaning and who does not, lie at the core of the planetary crisis. Who is left behind and how we relate to each other, how we relate to the planet are key questions. And in our keynote video, Hiab spoke of the plight, the Hessam of Eritrean refugees left behind and asked the question, do they even know we exist? And Piki spoke of the struggles to bring the knowledge of her people, of the Māori Whakawhanangatanga, into an equally respected balance with settler colonial knowledge in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And Tawana spoke of his work as a dramatist, welcoming little Amal back in November here to the city of Glasgow, a giant refugee puppet who had made her way from Syria to COP26 as a vital animating force of the arts. Together, our call on this panel is for a restorative frame, which allows for the integration of forms of knowledge and understanding from those experiencing the loss and damage in the eco-social life. It is here that the challenge of cultural justice can be more widely considered, and our beginnings of a theory of restorative integration might be developed, one extending to our whole planet and how we care for one another, for our Mother Earth, for Papatuanuku, for Ambuya, for Pachamama, and how she cares abundantly for us. Our panel discussion today, therefore, focuses on dimensions of what is left behind and who is still left behind, but also goes further than this. For as Amitav Ghosh also says, it would seem then that the idea that humans are the only storytelling animals is by no means an unproblematic reflection of reality. So the statement, no one is left behind, is to our minds insufficient and has prompted us to ask perhaps better questions than simply who is left behind and of our radical dependency. We're going to be looking at what it means when the cultural, spiritual, artistic, and linguistic understandings of the human role in the wider natural world are diminished or even excluded. And so first of all, I'd like to turn to you, Hiab, to ask you that question you ask in your own work. Who is left behind, and does the world even know that we exist? Thank you, Hiab.
Thank you, Alison. Yeah, let me start by giving a little bit of context of where these questions were asked. These questions were asked during my field work in Cairo, in Egypt, and it was asked by survivors of cyanide trafficking. Between 2009 and 2013, between 25 and 30,000 Eritreans were believed to be trafficked in the Sinai Desert, and almost half of them died in the desert. And the survivors, some of the survivors are still scattered throughout the region, some of them still in prisons. And when I was talking to them about these questions, they asked me, does the world know that we exist? Do they know that we're here? These were the questions that I was asking. And this story of trafficking and the story of tragic stories are not just limited to the Sinai context. Thousands of Eritreans have been dying in the deserts in Libya, in the sea, and in so many places as well. When I was in Cairo myself, after managing to escape myself from the Sinai trafficking, my friend texted me a message saying, born lightless, die lightless. And he died in the Lampedusa incident on October 3, 2013. And so was Johanna as well, who was with him on the same boat, who died with her newborn baby still attached to her with umbilical cord. And these are the stories I keep hearing throughout my research. And the questions they kept asking me is, does the world know we exist? What do these stories tell us? What do they say to us as human beings? And that's the question that troubles me a lot. And when we're talking about left behind, we can also talk about those left beneath there in the Sinai Desert, in the lifeless deserts of the Sinai and Libya and many other places, or those who are drowned in the Mediterranean Sea. And yeah, and another thing is these same structures, as Alison just pointed out as well, are leaving the land as well behind, not just the human beings. And what does it mean to move forward in these kind of contexts? Where are we moving to? And these are the questions that trouble me about today as well. And I think it's not those humans who continue to stay grounded in these wretched realities that are being left behind. What we are leaving behind is also our ethical responsibility to one another and to our own nature, the natural environment as well. We are becoming incapacitated to care, to share, to coexist, and also to stay grounded in these realities. And this is what I would invite you to think today. Can we it might be better for us to just stay or stop to listen to these stories or even think about them.
Thank you, Hiyab. I'd like to turn now to Piki and to the work that you have been doing and that your ancestors have been doing for generations, knowing the wretched realities of those whose land has been taken and those who've been left behind. And to ask you a deep question that you ask yourself: who are you as a living, landed, cultural being? And what has been left behind, and what's the work that you are doing to restore this? And we just need to unmute you.
Yeah, got it this time. Kia ora, getting there. Kia ora. Yes, and I really, to answer that first question, who am I, or ko waio, as a living, landed, cultural being, I will speak of an incident where I felt I was being left out, and it was in a professional setting. And my research is autoethnography. My role is a Māori academic developer in a university. And there was a lot of change happening in the university, and it came up to a point where I was being left out of the room, left off the table, that I was so used to being a part of. And in those actions, there were choices being made to exclude me. But through their actions, what I was feeling and what I was being told was, I don't belong. And that is what I was sensing and feeling, that I don't belong in the university as an academic developer, that I had nothing to offer my community. And once I felt that very painful hurt and grief, I felt my whole being kind of take all that kind of anger and grief and just kind of, and I stamped the ground. I actually, what we call takahia, I stamped on it, and I could feel my whole being just pulsate down into the land, so that it was cracking through the concrete institution. And I found myself saying to myself, ko te whenua ko te whenua ko, I am the land and the land is me. And I got really passionate, and knowing that the land is my mother and she will provide for me. She is my mana, she is my power, she gives me the intelligence. And it's through that really strong connection and going deep into her, I found that I was able to find the power to and the will to give her expression through her ways of being aroha, to show love, but also how to protect as well as a mother. So, you know, that was that intelligence that she gave me, and knowing that this is my land. So regardless of the concrete institution in which I am employed with, I have a deeper connection beyond the concrete that is into the land. And that's where I found, you know, I do belong. I belong as an Indigenous person to these lands. And this really became my mantra throughout my thesis, especially in the later parts of it. And I kept saying to myself, I belong, I belong, I belong, ko te whenua ko te whenua ko. And as Alison pointed out, my resilience and my attitude, that fight that comes from deep within, came from knowing the context of these lands around Te Tiriti, knowing the history that my people and my ancestors had to fight for, and the blood that was shed on these lands, and trying to fight and give space for and hold space, not even just to hold the space and land for our people. So that was, I felt, was my responsibility to my ancestors, to carry on that legacy, but not just to the past, to honour the past, but also to honour the future. And it's so much work that myself and a lot of our Māori colleagues do within these spaces. So it's about holding space, not only physically, but also spiritually, so that we can practice our cultural ways of being. Now, to talk about who or what is left behind and how do we restore those connections, for me, it's about first asking the question, where are we going? Often we talk about success and progress without asking the question to where will these ideas lead us to? Or what are we sacrificing, or who are we sacrificing to get there? And in Aotearoa, New Zealand, who is being left behind is our Māori people. And the horrifying truth is that it seems that with these industrial kind of beliefs and ideals of progress, that what we're leaving behind is basic human needs and basic humanitarian ways of being, which here mentioned. And it's those basics around healthy homes, access to affordable, healthy food, the fact that you pay more for a bottle of water than you do for a bottle of Coke or even alcohol is horrendous. Basic human needs to clean drinking water and to maintain our connection to our families. I think the financial economic story structures keep telling us the story that you need money to survive. But in that story, we move away from our homelands, our tribal lands, and people like myself who have done that. What we leave behind are our people. So when we do leave, we have a responsibility and duty to tell people about them, but not just in terms of the deficit story, but also in the beauty in which they hold. In my research and in my practice, all I'm bringing is those beautiful values that I learned growing up on a marae, which is our community homelands, and ways of practicing our rituals. And they're just really beautiful ways of being, that we're manaaki, or being generous and caring and protecting our people and our lands, is the greatest measure. So when we talk about, what has been left behind, like here, I think we need to also acknowledge that if we are leaving those moral values and ways of being left behind, personally, I think I would prefer to stay behind if it means, in the name of progress, industrial progress, I certainly would choose to stay behind. But hopefully we work towards a way that we can bring these into our ways of being, and so that everyone can be these conduits and expressions of the land, both spiritually, physically, and emotionally. And so that at some stage, and this is my hope, my dream, the thing that keeps me going with what I do, is that one day that we can all say, ko au te whenua, ko te whenua ko au. I am the land and the land is me. So, kia ora.
Kia ora, Vicky. Ko au te whanua, ko te whanua ko au. I am the land and the land is me. And thank you so much, Vicky, for just reminding us of the beauty of what has been rejected, what has been destituted, what has been created into something wretched through myths of progress, which are now threatening our planetary survival. And for speaking of the grief and also how you deal with that grief, the stamping on the earth, the reminder of how to reconnect with the land, and asking us the question, where are we going? And is it a myth of progress, or is it something else that we might find that is actually present in a return if we are genuinely to co-build an eco-social world? Tawana, I know that these are questions which are also dear to your own heart, and that I too can ask you the question, who are you as a living landed cultural being? But also, how is it that you, as someone who lives as a migrant within Scotland on this land here, but comes from the beautiful land of Zimbabwe, how is it that you listen to and communicate with the land? How is it that you co-build an eco-social world in several places at once?
Thanks, Alison, and thanks to Hiev and Vicky for getting our brains ticking. I really love storytelling. As we are doing today, we are in an exchange of stories, and stories, as well as being entertaining and magical, and the many things that they allow us to do. I'm noticing more and more that listening as a practice, maybe professionally, but as a personal activity, it's something that I don't think we do very well at the moment. It's something that maybe we can learn to do better. I had a beautiful quote recently that we listen to respond rather than listen to understand what others are saying to us. So storytelling for me, it's not about the telling mostly, because we lead with this word of telling, but it's the listening that I think is so important, that if we take time to listen more deeply to each other, listen more deeply to the space, listen more deeply, we may hear the sounds that hum underneath our tarmacked existence. I'm a mere musician, and that allows me to honor the ancestors' knowledge. Thanks, Vicky, for bringing that. But it also allows me an opportunity to learn as I try to share this music with others. In terms of stories, the Little Amal project, it was such a wonderful endeavor, because you had, you're trying to tell the story of a difficult journey. So, the people in Good Chance Theatre Company, what a wonderful idea they came up with. How can you do this as creative people? You get a 3.5 meter tall puppet, which is operated by a team of puppeteers and other coordinators. You relate that with 8 other teams in Scotland, in France, and in the 7 other countries that the puppet has to walk. So this puppet walks on land and crosses water at different points. So it is this listening to each other, the puppeteers listening to the coordinators outside, telling them the outside conditions, those who are inside, almost stifling, suffocating, but still going on this journey, and they made it 8,001 kilometers to Scotland. And in the meantime, Amal is sharing stories with her peers in Scotland. It's quite ironic that, we're more technologically connected, but it seems in terms of listening, there is still something missing. So little Amal sharing stories with her peers, other 9-year-old children in Scotland, and getting a conversation about normal 9-year-old things, music tastes. And, we honored the lines that Amal was passing by Amal telling us the foods, the tastes, the smells that she was encountering. And Amal arriving here to a welcome from Scottish children, and us as theatre makers coming outside our known practice and challenging ourselves to doing things differently. The difficulty of that, but how rewarding that is. And then meeting Amal, and most importantly for me was the interaction between Amal and the children in Scotland. And her story was not about someone who is pitiable or is to be resented or rejected, but her story was of her aspirations that she shared with the children of Scotland, children of the world. They are the future, and they care what happens to this planet. So they came with the message of saying to the world leaders, this is what we want to see in our future. So that is such a beautiful thing to be involved in that story.
Thank you, Tawana, and thank you for bringing this panel into a circle. So we began with Hiab's story of those forgotten, those buried in the Sinai Desert, those left behind, those now belonging to the earth again. And then hearing from Piki as an Indigenous Māori educator about ways in which she struggled and felt herself left behind. And then the work of art that is little Amal, this giant puppet that arrived to tell a different story and to be animated as an object. We're really interested in the UNESCO Chair for Refugee Integration through Languages and the Arts, and in the way in which they can enable us not to understand refugees, people who have sought refuge, as pitiable people, but to understand people who have sought refuge as people seeking to re-indigenize, to make a home, to connect again with the land. And Hiab, I'm wondering from your work, what you think the limits are to some of the instruments that we use, the rights-based approaches to protection for the people that you have worked with.
Yeah, the idea of rights-based kind of approach is difficult when we're talking about people who are just considered as remainder humanity, where they're completely outside of the scope of the notion of the human itself. Those people who are just dying without, those people who can be killed without committing crime. That's what happened in the Sinai, and this is the story that I was trying to tell. And it's difficult to convince these people, particularly the people that I was working with, the survivors of this trafficking and all of that, to convince them that they do have human rights. It's difficult to convince them that they belong to the category of human being, because they don't see any of these rights dedicated to them. They feel rightless. And that's when I talk about my friend telling me, born rightless and die rightless. And the only thing I could tell him is, you are not alone. At that time, myself, I was in a difficult situation. I knew hundreds of people who were in that situation in the Sinai and in other places. And asking these questions that the world would know that whether we exist, that question basically is, do these powerful people know that we are human beings too? And if they know, why are we just dying in the deserts in these places? Where is our human rights if we are humans? So these are the questions that they keep asking me, and that's the question that I keep asking myself as well. And I have no answer to them.
Thank you, Hiab. And I think what that really demonstrates powerfully is that whilst we, particularly in the West, can enjoy ways of availing ourselves of instruments of human rights, even though at this moment in the United Kingdom, these are at risk once again. And these rights, which were enshrined almost as a sacred charter for us 70 years ago after the Holocaust and the Second World War, that these do not extend equally to everybody, and that there are those that human rights and their framings leave behind. I know, Piki, that your work operates under Ote Tiriti or Waitangi, under the Treaty of Waitangi, which is a fraught document. And I wonder if you might say a little bit about your experience of trying to square a circle that means living under treaty in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Kia ora, Alison. Yeah, it has been a journey, and you know, in our university and in many of the universities, we're called, and education throughout New Zealand, we're called to meet our obligations under Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And that is just, you know, the fact that it has never been honoured. You know, that, so it's actually doing the struggle and the hard work of trying to figure out what does it mean to honour. And I guess that was the question that came to me, that was the call from SAF for me to engage, was what does it mean to honour Te Tiriti in practice? Because like so many things, we see the documents, but then to actually manifest it is another idea or another practice altogether. So, you know, we've been on this journey of trying to figure out what this means and working through who each of us are coming into the relationship together. You know, both as Māori and as non-Māori, what does that mean? And really, I guess for me, I've been using Māori frameworks and rituals to help both our Māori and non-Māori colleagues take another lens to connect back to indigeneity, both our Māori back to Aotearoa or our peoples again, and to remember our own knowledge systems and our own ways of being, and then to even challenge our non-Māori to say, hey, where are you from? You know, what lens do you know? And for many, I hear, especially from our white colleagues, our British and European, they will say, oh, we don't have a culture. And it's, well, yes, you do. You've just forgotten it. Or it's called something like, you know, principles and institutions. So the language has changed for them, so they're not recognizing it as a culture. So it's unpacking all of that and then helping them kind of connect to a land, or if they struggle with that, seeing how our land offers so much storying around morals and using creative narratives that we hold within our lands for them to connect to Māori ways of being that are moral value based. Yeah, so I think that's the hard work, and it's breaking, it feels like breaking through that concrete, layers of concrete every time. But you know, what we're finding is people are wanting it more because they're just so tired of the treadmill. They know that it's not working, they know it's broken, but it's, you know, these are hundreds and hundreds of years of a way of being. So, you know, it's going to take time and it's going to take care. It's going to take, feels like me hitting my head up against a brick wall a lot, but, you know, we keep doing it because, you know, I guess for me, I have faith in people. I have hope. So, yeah, that kind of just keeps driving me. And with, you know, I have my two girls that, you know, their father's Scottish and me being Māori. You know, we hope that they can live in a world where that all comes together. So, yeah, that's a bit about what we've been doing.
Thanks. Thanks, Piki. And I think your experience and the work you've done on living under Ote Tiriti, under the treaty, with those two different words, the bilingualism, the biculturalism, is a way of seeing through all the struggle and imperfection that there is a way of attempting to transform conflict, not by saying which one will win, but by saying how can we live with the tensions between the two of both and. We're going to open this out to wider questions in a moment, but I'd like to come back to Tawana, because I know that you have been trying to expand frameworks from your own traditions in the Dare, of also asking that question, who am I? When the answer is not just, I am a professor, or I am a doctor, or I am the limit of my professional role, and how that has helped you to connect people to this abundance that Piki has been speaking about, and that Hiab was speaking of as being left behind or as being destituted.
Thanks, Hanson. Yeah, I think, you know, I talked about stories earlier, and our names are stories. I am embracing my true name, if I can call it that, Ganyamatoke, because this name, it is a reminder for me that I am, you know, always part of a collective. So it reminds me that what I'm doing should always reflect on the collective. So it takes away some of the self-centered thinking, I guess. And it also, the word that our ancestors used is pasichigai, which is we are nature. We are not sitting on nature. Nature is not our backdrop to do all the things that we, you know, that come into our heads. So I think this reminder is really important. And as I am in Scotland, the hills are here, you know, sitting, the rivers are running. So I feel energized by that. You know, wherever I am, there's a tree, there are people. And for me, my work is about connecting with people. And there's nothing more I focus my attention on, because there is always an opportunity to make a connection with someone. And through that someone, we share language, we share knowledge, we share ancestral history, all these things. And we keep on reminding ourselves that the work, thank you, Peggy, the work is difficult, but we need to keep reminding ourselves that the work is vital.
Thank you, Tawana. And I think certainly in working with all three of you over the years, learning words for the land that are out with those words we use in English as this dominant and dominating language in the world, words like Papatuanuku, words like Pasi, words which remind us that cultures around the world have different understandings and different historical and ancestral traditions for connecting to what we are calling here the eco-social world, and ways of relating and connecting, that it's often those ways of relating to the earth that we lose and are left behind. And so in much of our work within the UNESCO chair of late, we've been looking to a permacultural approach. Permaculture was an approach to gardening, really, to looking after and caring for the land that David Holgram and Bill Morrison listened to and observed from Indigenous people in Australia in the 1970s. And they came up with a slogan, which was earth share, fair share, people share. That actually, if you look carefully, if you listen, if you observe, you will see that the way that nature, Pasi, Papatuanuku, is working with us is through an abundance, and particularly an abundance of edges, of marginalia, and that it is those plants that grow on the edges that are often, in traditional knowledge, the pioneers, the resilient species, but also the medicinal species. And gradually, as in this arc, we bring together those disciplinary traditions of chemistry and biochemistry and international development and refugee integration and the creative arts, we start to see those margins connecting and allowing us to ask in the academy new questions about that abundance that in many of the Enlightenment traditions were lost to us. But what I think that Piki and Hiab and Tawana and the traditions of many of you listening online and committed to this work of the People's Global Summit are wishing to find again, listen to again, learn from again as part of an abundance that might be part of that well-being that we heard about in the address from the Secretary General of the United Nations in the opening of this, and from our keynote speaker from South Africa. So I'd like to take some time to open this out to our online panel, but also to our audience here for questions to Tawana, to Hiab, and to Piki, or between yourselves. So over to you.
Anyone have
Any
questions or comments?
Or comments?
Even. Well, if not, I'll just start. I'll just start by reading a few of the comments from chat, if that's okay.
Thanks, Lauren.
So thank you to everybody who's engaged with us online. Sally has said that we need more picky power in New Zealand. Thank you for persevering and being such a fine descendant of your, now I'm going to butcher this and I do apologise, Tipuna Arohanui.
Yeah, Tipuna Arohanui.
Thank you. Sorry. And Sarah Banks has commented that his comment about leaving moral values and ways of being behind is particularly poignant. It highlights how values can become abstracted and academic if they're not lived out by people. They have also said the ideas of values really link with the way that the stories are passed down from generation to generation, and that way is being lost, and that's from Simon. Tal has said that the voice of the people and their experiences are crucial to keeping values relevant. Community.
There's a new question from Sarah.
Okay, thank you. And I'll just say one more thing from Tal, that the loss of intergenerational community narrative, and especially land-based and spiritual narrative, really interferes with cohesive and relevant value sets. So I'll just go down to Sarah's question. How to ensure values live in us and we recreate values. This raises a question of how to keep values alive and relevant in new contexts so they're not fossilized and regarded as dinosaur values. Any comments?
Great questions, and thank you to Simon, Sarah, and Tal particularly for those questions. And I love that we need a bit more picky power. I'm wondering maybe if we can come to you, Picky, to start with, because there was that lovely reflection about Tipuna Arohanui and Aroha, and I wonder if you might explain to the audience what that actually means, but maybe if you go first with this question of
Sure.
ensure the values aren't fossilized.
Yeah, so Te Puna is the well or the spring in which things come from. Life is, and all creation comes from the water. We all come from water. And Arohanui is translated lots of love. But when we look into words, Aroha, especially Aroha, which is often translated to love, Aroha or Aro means to pay attention to, Ha, the breath. So Aroha isn't just this about love, it's to pay attention to the breath of your own breath, to another's breath, and what happens to our breath when we engage and relate with each other or relate with our land as well. But I think I love the question because it's how do we ensure that we keep doing the hard work, and the hard work is actually enacting our values. That's the hard work. My daughter, when I was, I think she was 2 or 3 years old, and she had a fight with her sister. I've got twins. And she just turned to me, Isla, she turned to me and she goes, Mama, it's hard work being good. And I'm like, you're so right, baby. I know it. But, I think for our Indigenous, I talked about the marae, in there we have our rituals that we enact formally, our values and ways of being, and that gets almost programmed into us, and then those are replicated in our family homes. So it's things like take your shoes off it, but when we go into the wharenui, it's about, don't sit on where food is, don't touch people's heads. So there's sorts of belief systems that kind of ingrained in us from our rituals. And it's actually when we come out of our cultural safe havens that there's this kind of curiosity or inquiry. Like I went from being rural to living in urban, and I just found it the most strangest, and I began to wonder, and as I did my work, how can people treat each other like this? How can as universities we constantly be treating our staff who are on the front line and just load them with so much work and just think that they're there to be abused and, you know, pillaged and so forth. So that was where I just went, no, I need to manaki. That was and manaki is to be generous and to care. And that's how I care from my ways of growing up on a marae and in a whānau, in a Māori family. Kia ora.
Thanks, Vicky. Kia ora. And Tawana, I wonder if I can come to you, because Vicky's just mentioned the ways in which she works with values, but also the rituals and the traditions of the marae. And I'm just wondering from your experience what you do to stop this being a fossilized past way of describing a life that was romanticized and anthropologized in the past, but you're able to keep it alive and living.
Yeah, well, I compose words so my past doesn't decompose. I'm just making reference to one of my poems. You know, poetry, what it means to me, you know, poetry is an attention to language. You know, language is this thing that we all have access to in whatever ways, but, you know, the ability to make someone's day. We know how it feels if you're just walking and the stranger smiles or just nods or acknowledges you. You know, how are you? The question, how are you, we ask it every day, but we perform this standard poetry that we feel we don't want to bother other people. So when people say, how are you? We say fine. And this fine is like a veneer that covers so much more. Why don't we just take a bit more time? Because if you ask someone, how are you twice, you'll probably get a different answer. And also with our language, our encounters with people, sometimes they're very brief, sometimes they're more deeper, but we don't even know what we can do to someone's day. A good word can just alleviate something for that person. You don't know what it is, but you know, if you add something toxic to someone's day, you're just adding to what they're already carrying. We're all carrying a lot. So caretaking for language and just knowing its power and its potential and its beauty. That's why I think of poetry in that way, of really thinking about what we do with language. And I've learned this from within the Dare. Language is really seen in that way, as this really you know, beautiful thing that we need to take care of. The same way we need to take care of, you know, the environment from which there's a great phrase in Scotland. They say, you know, the language springs from the land, and I love this. So yeah, it is within that kind of ethic that I try to do my work.
Thank you. Lauren, one more question online?
One more question from online, and this is from Tal. It's for Picky, but I think it could go to anybody really. Do you have any strategies for getting professionals in academic settings to open up to spiritual concepts and values?
Thank you. Vicky.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started this, I know I'm dealing with academics, so you don't go head to head with an academic, and you certainly don't go head to head with a room full of academics. But I tell them my limits and kind of break some of what they thought they were going to learn, which is about Te Tiriti as a political document or the language. And I just say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to teach you what it means to view the world through my marae eyes. So I'm going to go heart to heart with you. And that kind of just dispels those barriers, or that, you know, then they're like, oh, okay, this isn't going to be an attack on what I've done as a non-Māori or to an Indigenous people. Actually, we're going to actually have an open heart conversation. And I just hold the space for them to unpack some of our words, but I give them, instead of translations, for example, our word whenua, they often know is for land, but it's also known as for placenta as well. But then I will give them how I know the word whenua, and that she is our mother. So therefore, who is our mother? What does it mean to be mother? What is the responsibility of mother? What happens to a mother and the child she might be carrying if we do not care for her? Then how do we? And then that unpacks these ideas and ways of being mother, of being a carer, And then I just simply ask, how do you experience that, or how in the profession, and how do we allow our students, give our students opportunities to experience that? So yeah, that's sort of how I do it.
Thanks, Vicky. I'm just going to come to Hiab for a last word and attempt at that question as well, about how you keep your values alive, because I know that, you know, as you were saying in your keynote video and earlier, you know, you have survived the trafficking and the torture. You have seen the worst that human beings can do to one another, and yet you continue to strive to keep your values alive in a professional setting. How do you do it?
Yeah, that was a difficult question. Yeah, I think when we talk about values, I would like to think as what are the structures that prevent from preserving values? What is that? What that's stopping us from preserving or living with our values? And what are these structures? Is it the borders? What is it? Is it capitalism that is growing lots of greed? What kind of structures are creating these new emerging values that have systems of violent systems? And that is the biggest question for me. And the idea of trying to survive is not an individual effort. It is bigger than individual, and surviving requires bigger than individual efforts. And when I was going through all these difficult times, not just by myself, but also other people, it was the people who were trying to help us who saved the lives. And these people are not, they're often the people who are also struggling or in the same struggle as you are. And that's where the survival starts, is working together as a team, as a group, and not leaving anyone behind, at least from the positions that you are in. So, and talking about values as well, we were earlier talking about human rights and all of the rule of law, these are considered as values. How can you make sure these are non-exclusive? How can you make these are expanded to everybody? And that way, and also distributing the violence within these kind of structures and systems, whether it's state systems or institutions, all of that. How do we distribute the violence within these kind of structures? I think we need to ask these questions to come up with ideas about how to preserve our values.
Thank you, Hiab. I love the balance that we've just had there between the abundance, the beauty, the past that we don't romanticize, but we seek to struggle to hold, at the same time as destituting, the word that you've just used here, the structures of violence that seek to remove us from that abundance that is present and still available and continues to give, despite all the ways that we close this down. I want to begin to bring this panel to a close, obviously with thanks to our panelists, to Hiab, to Piki, and to Tawana. The work of refuge, of welcome and sanctuary is highly contested in the world today and runs many risks of cultural appropriation, of reparation, of securitization, and in particular of violence. And the world's most insecure are those upon whom the strongest and often most violent technologies, especially those of the state, are brought to bear. The seeking of refuge is not, however, just a matter of safety and protection of the body. When refugees speak of those left behind or what is left behind, a wealth of cultural and living heritage is evoked. And the same is true when Indigenous peoples seek to preserve what is being destituted still within their own lands. The games played as children, the precise feel of spring or rain or shade or snow, the way in which the land made life, the way families could move or stay, with lives largely lived in a different kind of freedom. And when we're working with those who sought refuge in Scotland through the work of the UNESCO Chair, it's impossible for us to think intellectually about people who arrived without absolute acknowledgement of all that is also left behind, that is Indigenous and is re-indigenizing and re-diversifying here. In other words, it's impossible to think of refugees without at the same time acknowledging the indigeneity of refugees and the restoration needed to re-indigenize in this new context, and in a context which was Scots and Lowlands and Gaelic, as well as also English speaking. And this means a deep listening, peaceable and somatic reciprocal relationship to the land here. And it's for this reason that we wish to propose a permacultural focus for the work of ensuring that no one is left behind. In the Arizona desert, the great saguaro, those huge iconic cacti, are understood by the Tonoho O'odham people as beings with personhood. And the recent Rights of Nature movement has seen elements of the natural world endowed with rights. Te Orowera in Aotearoa, New Zealand, was the first example in northeast Aotearoa in 2014, following a long struggle by the Tuhoi people. When a person seeks refuge, the uprooting does not mean need to mean that nothing that was cultural, living, lovely, and languaged has to be left behind. Indeed, we know this is not the case, even though we treat refugees as if all those elements need to be divested or further destituted in a new home. The best of integrating work means the richness of language and culture, of land and law, can be brought together into a meeting of many edges and those living in the new land. Festivals of sharing of language and culture are points of enrichment and demonstrate clearly why it is important to learn precisely from the examples of Hiab and of Piki and Tawana. And therefore, in the spirit of this panel for a new eco-social world, our last voice will be to the earth and to the music of the Mbira. Thank you, Tawana.